Hi, I'm 619Gobel. I am in group 2, and this one is going to be on the Johnson book, chapter 6. And this chapter talks completely about reasoning equal to verbal behavior. I like this book actually compared to Skinner, because Skinner's book is so hard to understand. Is reasoning more than verbal behavior? In this book, they say, according to Skinner, that it's not, that reasoning is verbal behavior. And then in my open-ended question, I kind of came up with it in the beginning of reading this because it was my first thought when I went through the first chapter. It also talks about the way that verbal behavior builds on each other, and I think that that's interesting as well. On page 120, in the third paragraph, it talks about verbal behavior in reasoning in the concept of if you believe it, then it's true. And it says in here, the listener's behavior with reference to the proposition may also be effective or ineffective regardless of the truth of the proposition. So, and the example they used is if somebody tells you that your dress is pretty, you're going to believe that your dress is pretty. And it doesn't matter. To me, the first thing I thought of was perception. The whole concept of perception. And it's not something that's talked about in behaviorism because it's a mentalist term is what I'm thinking. But to me, when it says, continuing our example, although no one else may believe this dress is pretty, if your girlfriend finds it reinforcing to wear the dress as a result of your compliment, the proposition is effective for her. So basically, your truth is your truth. And that is, to me, equates to a perception. I'm not sure how you guys feel about that. I think it's kind of interesting, and excuse me if I keep glancing over at my notes so I don't forget some of the points I wanted to make. But basically, a compliment is reinforcing. And so if somebody tells you that what you're wearing is hideous, you're probably not going to wear it. But if somebody tells you it's beautiful, you're going to wear it regardless of the reality of it. And what I'm thinking is, what if somebody else comes along and tells you it's horrible? Is that going to reinforce the fact that I'm not going to wear it anymore? And I don't see in here where it addresses that as a situation. And I'm using that as an example. But if you do something because it's reinforced, a proposition is reinforced by a friend, and you're like, yeah, this is a beautiful dress, I'm going to wear it all the time. And somebody else, another friend or colleague or somebody that you respect, comes along and says, that doesn't look that great on you, you may want to choose something different. Then what happens? I feel like you have like a internal dilemma then, and it doesn't address that. So I thought that was pretty interesting. Deductive reasoning is another thing, and they talk about it as rule governed, and basically it's rule governed behavior, and that I thought was a pretty interesting tie into the last week's work that we did. I had a question in here, and this isn't my open-ended question for the end of this, and I'm sorry if my camera keeps moving around, but I don't really have a table to put this on. On page 124, I was looking in the book, and it talks about combustion and the implication that connecting two simple propositions by an additional verbal response is the most common form of deductive reasoning. And I'm just thinking that if somebody tells you, And the example they use is oxygen and combustion. If there's combustion, then oxygen must be present. If a listener accepts this proposition and also accepts the simple proposition that the antecedent of the implication, there is combustion, it's likely that the listener will also accept the consequence that oxygen is present. Well, isn't that easy to test? I mean, if you wanted to make sure that it wasn't false and you weren't just drawing a conclusion, you could just deprive it of oxygen and see if it works. So I'm wondering if that's the case with everything. And I think that that's a problem that lies on another issue in believing what we hear, believing everything we read. Too, do we make decisions, quality reasoning, based on what we've learned, or is it based on a proposition by somebody that we think is respected? So Wikipedia, I think, is a great example of that. We go on there all the time. Google it, Google it, Google it. So if I don't know something, I'm going to Google it. Which proposition do you find is the truth? And this is another thing, like, for me, because I'm tied to mentalist psychology, and I lost my train of thought. But when you go and you accept somebody's proposition, what about confirmation bias? So that's what I thought of right away there. Like, I'm going to go on and I'm going to Google it, but I'm going to probably agree with the proposition that is most likely related to my own thought process and my own values. So with that being said, I just think that my deductive reasoning is going to be affected by my own biases. I don't know what you guys think about that, but and I guess in reading this chapter, I was really, those are the thoughts that come up. So when I read through the chapter, I try to come up with just questions for myself, which helps me understand what the chapter's about. So after deductive reasoning came inductive reasoning, and honestly, I wasn't really like awesomely into that. It talks about, if you're on page 125, and I just refer to this because this is where I was reading through in the chapter, is there a difference between deductive and inductive reasoning? And there's a traditional distinction between them in forms of reasoning, but then it goes on to talk about the distinction not working for behavior analysts because all examples of reasoning as verbal behavior and not special kind of behavior. So a traditional position on deductive reasoning and inductive reasoning are lies, not are lies, but lies in assumptions about reasoning as a mental activity. And maybe that's where I'm getting caught up because I'm trained in psychology. Mentalist, I guess, is more of my background. So I really have that crossover where it makes me think about perception and not necessarily what is observable. So that's part of why when we talked about the combustion earlier, I was like, okay, we can test that. We can observe that. We can cut off the oxygen and we can see if it still works. And so that was one of the, probably one of the things that I struggle with in general when I'm working strictly in behavior, is because it's hard for me to separate that encroaching want to connect psychology. All right, I just want to look and make sure. And they also talk about the fact that inductive reasoning and deductive reasoning really lies in whether you believe the person that's telling you the proposition. If you believe the proposition, then that's what makes it your truth. And that's where you draw your conclusions. Reasoning, according to Skinner, is no different than other verbal behavior and involves the same response classes. That I had to keep going back and back and back and reminding myself of that when I'm looking at this from this approach. We know, we think, we judge, we assume. And I think that right there was great. What we know, believe, think, judge, or assume. And that's the proposition. That's the core concept of reasoning. So you can't have reasoning without a proposition. And somebody gives you a proposition and it's reinforced, and then therefore you believe. And this is what, I guess maybe like I'm just thinking too deeply into it, but what I'm thinking is that isn't this like just how you can influence people's thoughts and behaviors if you're giving them a proposition they believe? So now I'm running out of time. So let me give you my open-ended question. And this is what my open-ended question is. Internal dialogue. We all have internal dialogue. Would internal dialogue be considered verbal behavior? So if we don't say it out loud and we say it within and we don't write it down, is it still considered verbal behavior? And that is my question. Thank you for watching.